The punch came without warning, without protocol, without witnesses. Admiral Hayes didn't hesitate, didn't announce his intention, didn't give her a chance to explain. His fist connected with her jaw in the sterile silence of the command briefing room, the sound sharp and final like a gavel closing a case that had never been opened. She didn't cry out, didn't stumble backward, didn't even blink. What she did was something far more dangerous. She smiled. What Admiral Garrett Hayes didn't know, as his knuckles throbbed from the impact, was that the woman he'd just struck for what he called flagrant disrespect wasn't just another insubordinate officer questioning his judgment. She wasn't some desk-bound analyst who'd gotten too comfortable with her clearance level, and she definitely wasn't the kind of person who absorbed violence and walked away quietly. What she was someone who'd spent the last 8 years in places that didn't appear on any official map, doing things that required a different kind of authorization entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By the time his 2 bodyguards registered the sound of the strike and started moving toward her, she had already calculated the distance between Hayes's exposed ribcage and her left elbow. By the time they took their second step, she had already identified the pressure point behind his ear that would drop him like a stone. And by the time they reached for their sidearms, Admiral Garrett Hayes was unconscious on the marble floor of the Pentagon's most secure briefing room, and nobody, not the bodyguards, not the surveillance cameras, not even Hayes himself, had seen exactly how it happened. Now, before we show you the precise move that left a decorated admiral unconscious in under 2 seconds, and the words she spoke that made his security detail freeze with their hands halfway to their weapons, drop a comment telling us what you think happened to that admiral when he woke up. Smash that like button if you think some people need to learn the hard way. That rank doesn't give you the right to put your hands on anyone. And hit subscribe, because today's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. The morning had started like any other at the Riverside Naval Intelligence Center, a sprawling complex of glass and steel nestled between the rolling hills of Northern Virginia, where classified briefings happened behind soundproof doors and careers were made or destroyed with the stroke of a pen. The autumn air carried the scent of oak leaves and diesel fuel from the motor pool, mixing into something distinctly military, distinctly American, distinctly serious. This wasn't some recruiting station where fresh-faced kids came to sign papers and chase dreams. This was where strategy was born, where decisions got made that rippled across continents, where the kind of people who never appeared in newspapers gathered to discuss things that would never make the evening news. Lieutenant Commander Alexis Kane had been called to Briefing Room 7 for what her orders described as a priority consultation on overseas asset management. Standard language for what usually meant sitting in a chair for 3 hours while senior officers debated intelligence reports she'd written but couldn't officially acknowledge. Her dress blues were pressed sharp, ribbons aligned with mathematical precision, shoes polished to mirror brightness. Everything regulation, everything proper, everything exactly as it should be for someone with her service record. What wasn't regulation was the way Admiral Hayes had been looking at her since she'd entered the room 20 minutes earlier. Not the professional assessment of a superior officer evaluating a subordinate's competence. Something else. Something that made her skin crawl and her training instincts sharpen to a fine edge. She'd seen that look before in places where men thought their authority made them untouchable, where they confused respect with fear and command presence with the right to take whatever they wanted. Hayes was 62 years old, silver-haired, square-shouldered, with the kind of face that photographers loved for recruitment posters. 3 stars on his collar, 30 years of service. a chest full of commendations that spoke of a career spent climbing ladders and managing perceptions. What his official biography didn't mention was the pattern of female officers requesting transfers from his command, the complaints that never quite made it to formal channels, the way conversations went quiet when he entered a room full of women in uniform. Lieutenant Commander Kane knew none of this history as she sat across from him in the mahogany-paneled briefing room, reviewing classified documents on her tablet while he pretended to read intelligence summaries. What she knew was that his eyes kept drifting from the papers to places they had no business being, that his questions had nothing to do with overseas operations, and that the way he'd dismissed his aide and locked the door behind them had nothing to do with classification protocols. When he'd asked her to explain her attitude problem regarding his oversight of her last mission report, she'd responded with the kind of direct, factual clarity that 8 years of special operations had taught her. No embellishment, no emotional language, just the truth delivered with the precision of someone who'd learned that in certain situations, clarity could be the difference between living and dying. She'd told him that his questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical situation she'd been reporting on, that his suggested modifications would have compromised operational security, and that perhaps he should review the classified annexes more carefully before offering strategic input. That was when he'd called it disrespect. That was when he'd stood up from behind his desk, walked around to where she sat, and told her that junior officers who couldn't show proper deference to their superiors needed to be taught lessons they wouldn't forget. And that was when Admiral Garrett Hayes made the final mistake of his military career. The briefing room had no windows, no secretary stationed outside, no intercom system that would carry voices beyond the soundproof walls, lined with classified material warnings and electronic interference shielding. Just thick steel doors that locked from the inside, mahogany paneling that absorbed sound, and surveillance cameras that Admiral Hayes had discreetly disabled, with a code sequence known only to flag officers with his level of clearance. Lieutenant Commander Kane realized this isolation wasn't accidental the moment Hayes moved from behind his desk. The way he'd positioned himself between her and the only exit, the casual manner in which he'd loosened his tie after dismissing his aide, the particular smile that spread across his face when he mentioned teaching lessons. None of this was improvised. This was planned, rehearsed, the kind of moment that happened when powerful men grew comfortable with the belief that their authority extended beyond professional boundaries into personal territory they had no right to claim. "You know what your problem is, Kane," Hayes said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone who'd given this speech before. "You think that because you've got some overseas experience, because you've got a few commendations on your chest, you can speak to a superior officer like we're equals." He took another step closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that his proximity became a form of intimidation. "But we're not equals, not even close." The space between them compressed to less than 3 feet. In any other context, among any other people, that distance would have been a clear violation of personal boundaries. But here, in this locked room, with his 3 stars against her silver oak leaves, it became something more dangerous, a demonstration of power that relied on her unwillingness to escalate a situation that could destroy her career with a single phone call. Kane remained seated, hands folded in her lap, posture unchanged. Her training had taught her to read situations, to assess threats, to calculate odds before they became action. What she read in Admiral Hayes' posture, in the predatory stillness of his movements, in the way his eyes had changed from professional irritation to something hungrier, told her this wasn't about military discipline anymore. This was about a man who'd confused his rank with permission, his authority with entitlement, his position with the right to do whatever he wanted to, whoever he wanted. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, sir," she said, her voice level, professional, giving him one last opportunity to step back from whatever line he was approaching. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion with your aide present, or reschedule for a time when—" "There's no misunderstanding," Hayes interrupted, his smile widening. "And there's no rescheduling. You see, Lieutenant Commander, respect isn't something you get to negotiate. It's something you give, whether you want to or not." He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, fingers pressing down with deliberate weight. And sometimes, when junior officers forget their place, senior officers need to remind them exactly where they stand in the chain of command. The touch lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Kane to register the pressure, the possessiveness, the clear message that this contact was happening because he wanted it to happen, not because any military protocol required it. Long enough for her to understand that Admiral Hayes had done this before, to other women, in other rooms, with the same confidence that comes from knowing the system will protect the powerful and silence the powerless. She stood slowly, carefully, moving with the controlled precision of someone who understood that every gesture from this point forward would either escalate or de-escalate a situation that had already moved far beyond anything that should happen between uniformed officers. Her movement forced Hayes to step back slightly, breaking the contact, creating space that felt both like victory and like the setup for something worse. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to maintain appropriate distance and conduct," she said, her words clipped, formal, the kind of language designed to create a paper trail if this ever reached an official inquiry. "This conversation has moved outside the bounds of professional interaction, and I believe we should—" The slap came before she finished the sentence. Not his fist yet, just his open palm across her cheek, sharp and sudden and designed to shock rather than injure. The sound echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot, and for a moment the room held that particular silence that follows violence, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. "Don't you ever," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, "presume to tell me what is and isn't appropriate in my own briefing room." He flexed his fingers, the threat implicit but unmistakable. "You're going to learn some respect, Lieutenant Commander. The easy way or the hard way, your choice." That was when Kane understood that Admiral Garrett Hayes had fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with. That the woman standing in front of him wasn't some fresh academy graduate who could be intimidated into silence. That her service record, which he'd clearly never bothered to read beyond the surface details, contained classifications and commendations that would have given any rational person serious pause before deciding to back her into a corner with no witnesses and no escape route. But Admiral Hayes wasn't being rational. He was being predatory. And predators, Kane had learned in places much more dangerous than Pentagon briefing rooms, only understood one language. She smiled. The smile wasn't what Admiral Hayes expected. It wasn't submission, wasn't fear, wasn't even defiance in the way he understood it. It was something else entirely, something that made the temperature in the room shift in a direction he couldn't quite identify. Lieutenant Commander Kane's expression held the kind of calm that comes from knowing something your opponent doesn't. The particular stillness of someone who's been underestimated so consistently that they've learned to use it as a tactical advantage. "You know, Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a conversational tone that seemed wildly inappropriate for a woman who'd just been struck by a superior officer, "I've been in situations where men thought they held all the cards before." She tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen. "It's fascinating how authority can make people feel invincible, right up until the moment they discover they're not." Hayes felt something flicker in his chest. Not quite alarm, but a recognition that this wasn't playing out according to the script he'd used successfully before. Other women had responded to that slap with tears, with stammered apologies, with the kind of broken submission that fed his need for dominance. But Kane stood there like she was evaluating him, like she was making calculations he couldn't follow, like she knew something about the next 5 minutes that he didn't. Before we reveal exactly what Lieutenant Commander Kane was calculating in those crucial seconds, and the specific words she spoke that made Admiral Hayes realize he'd made the biggest mistake of his career, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what happens next will show you why respect earned through fear isn't respect at all. It's borrowed time. Drop a comment below telling us if you've ever seen someone's overconfidence backfire spectacularly, and smash that like button if you think some people need to learn that rank doesn't make you untouchable. The briefing room seemed smaller now, the mahogany walls pressing closer as the dynamic between them shifted in ways Hayes couldn't quite grasp. He'd orchestrated this moment carefully, the isolated location, the disabled surveillance, the locked door, the gradual escalation from professional conversation to personal intimidation. Everything had proceeded according to his established pattern, the same sequence that had worked with Lieutenant Morrison 6 months ago, with Commander Phillips the year before, with others whose names he barely remembered because their compliance had been so predictable. But Kane wasn't following the script. She wasn't backing down, wasn't pleading, wasn't offering the kind of desperate negotiations he'd learned to expect from cornered officers who understood that their careers hung in the balance. Instead, she seemed almost amused, like she was watching a performance she'd seen before and already knew how it ended. "You're wondering what makes me different," she said, taking a half step to the left in what appeared to be casual movement but actually improved her positioning relative to the door and his bodyguards stationed outside. "You're thinking that maybe I don't understand the situation, that maybe I haven't grasped exactly how much power you have in this building, in this command structure, in this entire military apparatus that could crush me with a phone call." Hayes straightened, his confidence returning as she seemed to acknowledge the reality of their respective positions. This was more familiar territory, the moment when his targets began to understand the futility of resistance, when they started calculating the cost of fighting against someone with his connections, his influence, his ability to destroy careers with administrative efficiency. "Now you're getting it," he said, his smile returning. "You're finally starting to understand how things work at this level. Smart girl. I was beginning to think you might do something we'd both regret." He moved closer again, emboldened by what he interpreted as her acceptance of the inevitable. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize for your disrespectful behavior. You're going to show me exactly how sorry you are. And then we're going to forget this conversation ever happened, along with those modifications you made to my operational suggestions." Kane nodded slowly, as if considering his proposal with the seriousness it deserved. "That's an interesting offer, Admiral. Very comprehensive. You've clearly thought this through." She paused, her eyes never leaving his face. "There's just one small problem with your plan." "What's that?" Hayes asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't genuinely interested in her objections. The question was rhetorical, the kind of indulgent inquiry a cat might make before finishing off a mouse. "You never asked about my background," Kane replied, her voice taking on an almost educational quality, like she was explaining a simple concept to someone who'd missed an obvious detail. "You saw Lieutenant Commander. You saw the surface credentials. You saw what looked like a standard intelligence officer with overseas experience. But you never dug deeper into what kind of overseas experience." Something cold moved through Hayes's stomach, a whisper of intuition that suggested he might have overlooked something important. But it was too late to reconsider now, too late to back down from a confrontation he'd initiated and escalated past the point of retreat. His reputation, his authority, his entire understanding of his place in the hierarchy depended on maintaining dominance in moments like this. "I don't care about your background," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than it had moments earlier. "Whatever you think you've done, wherever you think you've been, it doesn't matter in this room. In here, I'm the only authority that counts." Kane's smile widened, and for the first time, Hayes noticed something predatory in it, something that reminded him of expressions he'd seen on the faces of special operations personnel, the kind of people who dealt with problems that required solutions the regular military preferred not to discuss. "That's where you're wrong, Admiral," she said, her tone shifting from conversational to something harder, something that carried the weight of experience gained in places where mistakes weren't just career-ending, they were fatal. "You see, for the last 8 years, I haven't been stationed anywhere that appears on official deployment records. I haven't been writing intelligence reports from behind a desk in Langley or Norfolk, or any other place where people wear dress blues and worry about fitness reports." Hayes felt his confidence beginning to crack, though he couldn't quite identify why. There was something in her posture now, something in the way she held her hands, something in her eyes that suggested she was no longer the cornered officer he'd thought he was intimidating. She looked like someone who'd been waiting for him to finish talking so she could get to work. "I've been in places where rank doesn't matter, where protocols don't exist, where the only thing that keeps you alive is being better, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else trying to kill you," Kane continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. "And Admiral, in those places, men who think they can take whatever they want don't get administrative reprimands or career counseling. They get educated in ways they remember for the rest of their lives." That was when Admiral Garrett Hayes finally understood that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. But understanding came too late because Kane was already moving. The Riverside Naval Intelligence Center stretched across 47 acres of Virginia countryside, its glass and steel architecture rising from meticulously landscaped grounds that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a military installation. But appearances deceived here, as they did in most places where America's real business got conducted behind facades of normalcy and bureaucratic routine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the central courtyard where officers in dress blues moved between buildings with the purposeful stride of people carrying classified folders and compartmentalized secrets. The air smelled of fresh concrete and autumn leaves, mixed with the underlying scent of electronics and filtered air that marked every government facility built in the last decade. Security was invisible but omnipresent. Cameras that looked like decorative fixtures, guards who dressed like maintenance workers, sensors embedded in landscaping that could detect everything from metal objects to elevated heart rates. Building 7 housed the most sensitive briefings, its upper floors restricted to personnel with clearances that required background investigations, measured in years rather than months. The corridors were wider than standard military construction, lined with abstract artwork that served the dual purpose of aesthetic appeal and sound dampening. Everything designed to project calm authority, the kind of environment where billion-dollar decisions got made over coffee and handshakes between people whose names never appeared in newspapers. Lieutenant Commander Kane had walked these hallways before, though never as the primary subject of a meeting she hadn't requested and didn't understand. Her orders had been specific but vague: report to Admiral Hayes for consultation on overseas asset management, Bring all relevant files. Prepare for extended discussion. Standard language that could mean anything from routine briefing to career-ending interrogation, depending on who was asking and why. The elevator to the 7th floor required 2 different key cards and a biometric scan. Kane's clearance allowed access, though the system logged her entry with time-stamp precision that would remain in databases long after whatever happened in Briefing Room 7 was forgotten by everyone except the participants. The walls here were different, thicker, lined with materials designed to prevent electronic surveillance from any source not specifically authorized by the facility's security protocols. Admiral Hayes had chosen this location carefully. Room 7 was officially designated for compartmented briefings requiring absolute privacy, the kind of discussions where national security took precedence over standard military protocols. Unofficially, it was where careers got shaped and reshaped, where officers learned which rules applied to them and which ones existed for other people. The room's isolation wasn't accidental. It was functional, designed for conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. Kane had studied the facility's layout during her security briefing 18 months earlier, when her assignment to the Intelligence Division first brought her to Riverside. Standard procedure for anyone with her clearance level, though most officers treated the briefing as routine rather than tactical preparation. She'd noted the exits, the surveillance coverage, the emergency protocols that governed everything from fire evacuation to lockdown procedures in case of security breach. Professional habit from years of training that emphasized knowing your environment before you needed that knowledge to survive. The hallway outside Room 7 was empty at 900 hours, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday morning when most briefings happened in the larger conference facilities on lower floors. But Kane registered the absence of foot traffic, the closed doors of adjacent offices, the particular silence that suggested careful scheduling rather than coincidental timing. Admiral Hayes had wanted privacy, and privacy in a place like Riverside required advanced planning and administrative authority that reached beyond standard command structure. She'd arrived precisely on time, as military protocol demanded, though punctuality in this context felt different than reporting for normal duty. The weight of her service pistol against her hip provided familiar comfort, though weapons were technically prohibited in most briefing rooms. Her clearance level exempted her from standard restrictions, a privilege that came with responsibilities she'd learned to take seriously in places where being armed made the difference between completing missions and becoming casualties. Admiral Hayes' aide had greeted her professionally, efficiently, with the kind of crisp courtesy that revealed nothing about what waited behind the mahogany doors. A brief exchange of credentials, a verification of security protocols, and then dismissal with instructions to proceed directly to the briefing room where Admiral Hayes was waiting. No coffee offered, no small talk, no indication whether this was routine consultation or something more significant. The briefing room itself reflected the building's aesthetic of understated authority, rich wood paneling, leather chairs arranged around a table that could accommodate 12 people but was set for only 2. Multiple screens capable of displaying everything from satellite imagery to classified video feeds, though none were active when she entered. A subtle hum of electronic systems that suggested sophisticated recording and communication equipment, all currently dormant. Admiral Hayes had been reviewing documents when she entered, though Kane's training allowed her to recognize the difference between genuine concentration and theatrical business. His posture suggested someone performing the role of busy senior officer rather than actually engaging with whatever papers occupied his desk. Professional awareness honed by years of reading people whose intentions weren't always aligned with their stated objectives. The morning briefing schedule allowed for 2 hours of uninterrupted discussion, according to the appointment log she'd glimpsed on the aide's desk. Standard duration for comprehensive intelligence review, though the locked door and disabled surveillance suggested this conversation would cover territory not typically discussed in official briefings. Admiral Hayes had created an environment where normal rules didn't apply, where his authority extended beyond military protocol into areas governed by different considerations entirely. Kane had recognized the setup before taking her seat, had calculated possibilities and prepared responses based on experience gained in places where underestimating threats could prove fatal. But recognition and preparation weren't the same as prevention, weren't the same as avoiding situations that required solutions military doctrine preferred not to acknowledge. The conversation had proceeded exactly as she'd anticipated until the moment Admiral Hayes revealed that his understanding of respect differed fundamentally from anything taught at military academies or codified in regulations governing conduct between officers. Lieutenant Commander Alexis Kane had learned to read people in places where misreading intentions meant death. 8 years of operations in countries that didn't officially exist on her service record had taught her to assess threats, calculate odds, and identify predators long before they revealed their true nature. But even with that training, she'd allowed herself to hope that Admiral Hayes might be different from the pattern she'd recognized within minutes of entering Briefing Room 7. The hope had been tactical as much as personal. Engaging with superior officers required a baseline assumption of professional conduct, even when instincts suggested otherwise. Military hierarchy demanded giving authority figures the benefit of doubt, allowing them opportunities to prove themselves worthy of their rank, rather than assuming the worst based on subtle behavioral cues that might be misinterpreted. But Admiral Hayes had eliminated ambiguity with methodical precision, each word and gesture confirming what Kane's training had warned her to expect from men who confused power with permission. The locked door, the disabled surveillance, the careful timing that ensured no witnesses. None of this was improvised. This was a practiced routine, refined through repetition with other women who'd found themselves alone with someone who believed his stars granted him access to whatever he wanted. Kane had developed what her psychological evaluators called adaptive invisibility during her years in classified operations. The ability to blend into whatever environment required her presence, to become unremarkable enough that hostile actors underestimated her capabilities until circumstances demanded revelation of her true nature. In traditional military settings, this translated to appearing as a competent but unremarkable intelligence officer, someone who followed orders and filed reports without drawing attention to skills that might raise uncomfortable questions about where she'd acquired them. Her service record reflected this carefully constructed anonymity: standard promotions, routine commendations, deployment histories that mentioned overseas assignments without specifying which overseas locations or what kinds of assignments required her particular expertise. To anyone conducting superficial review, which Admiral Hayes clearly had, she appeared to be exactly what her rank suggested: a mid-level intelligence officer with unremarkable background and conventional career trajectory. The reality was considerably more complex. Kane's actual training had begun not at the Naval Academy, where her official biography claimed, but at a facility outside Quantico that didn't appear on any military installation maps. Her instructors had been people whose names were classified above top secret, whose experience came from operations that required congressional oversight committees to be briefed in specially constructed rooms that prevented electronic surveillance from any source. They'd taught her things not covered in standard military curriculum: how to kill silently with improvised weapons, how to extract information from people who'd been trained to resist interrogation, how to disappear into civilian populations and operate for months without support or communication with command structure, how to identify threats before they fully developed and neutralize them with surgical precision that left minimal evidence for investigators who might ask uncomfortable questions later. More importantly, they'd taught her to recognize predators who used institutional authority to create opportunities for personal gratification, men who leveraged rank and position to corner subordinates in situations where resistance seemed futile and compliance appeared to be the only option that didn't destroy careers or lives. The instructors had been explicit about this particular threat. It existed within military structure just as it existed everywhere else, and personnel with her clearance level would encounter it eventually. The training had included specific scenarios, role-playing exercises where instructors played authority figures who crossed professional boundaries and demanded responses that balanced immediate personal safety with long-term operational security. Kane had practiced these scenarios until her reactions became instinctive, until she could assess and respond to sexual predators with the same tactical precision she brought to more conventional threats. But practicing scenarios in controlled environments was different from facing the reality of Admiral Hayes, stepping too close, speaking too softly, placing his hands where military protocol never authorized contact between superior and subordinate officers. The adrenaline response was identical: elevated heart rate, heightened awareness, automatic calculation of distances and angles. But the emotional component was more complex than training simulations could replicate. Anger was part of it, though anger was a luxury she couldn't afford, while still gathering intelligence about Hayes' intentions and capabilities. Disappointment was there too, the particular sadness that came from discovering that someone entrusted with authority over others had perverted that trust into something predatory. But underneath both anger and disappointment was something colder and more dangerous: the professional assessment of someone who'd been trained to solve problems that conventional military justice couldn't address. Kane had hoped that Admiral Hayes would prove himself worthy of the uniform he wore, that his initial behavior was misreading of social cues rather than deliberate intimidation. She'd given him multiple opportunities to step back from whatever line he was approaching, had used language designed to create space for retreat without loss of face for either party. Professional courtesy extended as far as safety allowed, which in this case meant exactly until the moment Hayes decided that her attempts at de-escalation were weakness rather than restraint. The slap had been revelation as much as assault, confirmation that Admiral Hayes had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with and what kind of response his behavior was going to generate. Kane's smile in the aftermath wasn't submission or fear or any of the reactions Hayes had learned to expect from other women he'd cornered in similar circumstances. It was recognition, the particular expression of someone who'd finally received permission to use skills that normal military duty kept carefully contained. For 8 years, Kane had been required to blend in, to appear unremarkable, to solve problems through channels and protocols that protected institutional reputation rather than individual justice. But Admiral Hayes had just created a situation where those constraints no longer applied. Her training had prepared her for this moment, though she'd hoped never to need it in an American military facility against a fellow officer. But preparation was what separated professionals from casualties, what allowed people with her background to survive encounters that destroyed others who hadn't been taught to recognize when situations moved beyond diplomacy into territory that required different solutions. Admiral Hayes was about to receive an education in the difference between authority and capability, between rank and competence, between intimidation and actual danger. Kane's smile was simply her way of acknowledging that his lesson was about to begin. Admiral Garrett Hayes had built his career on the careful cultivation of image and the strategic application of influence. 30 years of service had taught him that authority in the military operated on multiple levels: the official hierarchy that governed formal interactions, and the unofficial networks of power that determined whose careers advanced and whose stagnated in bureaucratic limbo. He'd mastered both systems with the methodical precision that had earned him his third star and the respect of peers who understood how the Pentagon's real business got conducted. His rise through the ranks had been textbook perfect. Naval Academy graduation with honors, early assignments that showcased his administrative capabilities, strategic positioning within commands that offered visibility to senior leadership. Each promotion had come precisely on schedule. Each new assignment had expanded his sphere of influence. Each commendation had reinforced his reputation as an officer who could be trusted with increasing levels of responsibility. But success at flag officer level required more than professional competence. It demanded political awareness, social connections, and the ability to manage constituencies that extended far beyond traditional military structure. Hayes had cultivated relationships with defense contractors, congressional staffers, and Pentagon civilians whose careers intersected with his own advancement. These networks provided early warning about budget allocations, personnel decisions, and policy changes that could impact his command responsibilities. The informal authority that came with these connections had proven more valuable than official rank in many circumstances. A word from Hayes could expedite procurement processes, accelerate security clearances, or arrange assignment preferences for officers whose loyalty he valued. Conversely, his displeasure could result in career-damaging delays, unfavorable fitness reports, or transfers to positions that offered limited advancement potential. This dual nature of military authority had shaped Hayes's understanding of how power operated within institutional frameworks. Official regulations governed what could be done through formal channels, but real influence came from understanding which rules could be bent, which protocols could be overlooked, and which situations allowed for creative interpretation of standard procedures. The key was maintaining plausible deniability while achieving objectives that might not align perfectly with written policies. Hayes had applied this philosophy to more than just administrative matters. Over the years, he'd identified female officers whose careers he could influence, whose professional futures depended on his recommendation and approval. The military's hierarchical structure created natural opportunities for mentorship relationships that could evolve into something more personal if handled with appropriate discretion. Lieutenant Morrison had been his first serious experiment in mixing professional authority with personal gratification. A promising intelligence analyst whose security clearance made her valuable to his command structure, she'd initially resisted his advances with the kind of principled objections that Hayes had learned to overcome through patient application of pressure. Career advancement opportunities withheld until attitudes adjusted. Assignment preferences delayed pending demonstration of proper respect. Social isolation enforced through subtle messages to other officers about her reliability and team compatibility. The process had required 6 months of careful manipulation, but Morrison had eventually understood that cooperation offered benefits, while resistance carried costs that extended beyond professional disappointment. Their relationship had continued for over a year, satisfying Hayes' need for dominance while providing Morrison with access to opportunities that would have remained closed otherwise. When she'd finally requested transfer to a different command, Hayes had approved it graciously, their mutual understanding ensuring discretion that protected both their reputations. Commander Phillips had required less conditioning. Her divorce had left her financially vulnerable, her custody arrangements dependent on maintaining military income that Hayes could influence through efficiency reports and promotion recommendations. She'd recognized the transactional nature of their relationship from the beginning, accepting his attention with resigned pragmatism rather than Morrison's initial resistance. Their arrangement had been more businesslike, less emotionally complicated, mutually beneficial in ways that made termination unnecessary until her retirement eliminated the leverage that made her compliance predictable. These experiences had taught Hayes valuable lessons about managing relationships that operated outside normal military protocols, the importance of choosing targets whose personal circumstances made them vulnerable to pressure, the necessity of maintaining official pretenses that provided cover for unofficial arrangements, the value of gradual escalation that allowed subjects to adjust psychologically rather than provoking dramatic resistance that might attract unwanted attention. Lieutenant Commander Kane had seemed to fit the established pattern when Hayes first reviewed her personnel file. Recently divorced, no significant family wealth, career prospects dependent on favorable evaluations from superior officers like himself. Her overseas assignments suggested resilience and adaptability that would transfer well to unconventional relationship dynamics. Her intelligence background indicated discretion and understanding of compartmentalized information that wouldn't be shared inappropriately. More importantly, Kane's file contained gaps that suggested classified operations requiring special handling. Officers with that kind of background understood better than most that certain activities couldn't be discussed through normal channels, that some situations required maintaining secrets that could damage careers if revealed improperly. Hayes had interpreted this as additional security for arrangements that needed to remain private. His initial approach had followed proven methodology, professional consultation that established his authority over her career prospects, gradual introduction of personal elements that tested her boundaries and comfort levels, physical proximity that normalized contact between them while maintaining plausible professional justification. Each step designed to condition acceptance of increasingly intimate interactions. But Kane's responses had been subtly wrong from the beginning. Not the compliance he'd learned to expect, not the resistance that typically preceded eventual cooperation, but something else entirely. A kind of professional assessment that made Hayes feel like he was being evaluated rather than courted, studied rather than seduced. Her demeanor suggested someone conducting reconnaissance rather than someone being recruited. The realization should have warned him to reconsider his approach, to investigate more thoroughly before proceeding with familiar tactics that might prove inappropriate for this particular target. But Hayes's confidence in his established methods, combined with his assumption that Kane's apparent calm indicated submission rather than preparation, had blinded him to signs that would have been obvious to someone less invested in maintaining patterns that had worked successfully before. He'd mistaken her professional courtesy for weakness, her restraint for fear, her analytical silence for the kind of defeated acceptance that had characterized his previous relationships with subordinate officers. These misinterpretations had led him to escalate confrontation with someone whose background contained elements he'd never bothered to investigate thoroughly enough to understand. Admiral Hayes was about to discover that Lieutenant Commander Kane represented a category of military professional he'd never encountered before, someone whose training and experience operated according to rules that made his authority irrelevant and his assumptions deadly. The transformation in Admiral Hayes's demeanor was subtle at first, like watching ice form on a window. Gradual changes that accumulated into something fundamentally different from what had existed moments before. His initial confidence, built on 30 years of successful intimidation and careful cultivation of power dynamics, began shifting into something more aggressive, as Kane's responses failed to follow the script he'd perfected through previous encounters. The slap had been intended as punctuation, a clear message that established the new rules governing their interaction. In Hayes's experience, physical contact crossed a psychological threshold that made resistance more difficult and submission more likely. The shock value created momentary paralysis that allowed him to consolidate control before his targets could organize effective opposition. But Kane's reaction, that smile, that analytical calm, suggested the psychological impact hadn't achieved its intended effect. Hayes moved closer again, this time with deliberate intent to crowd her personal space in ways that would make clear his physical advantages. At 6 feet 2 inches and 200 pounds, he'd always been able to use his size as an implicit threat, a reminder that compliance offered safety while resistance invited escalation. His voice dropped to a register designed to be both intimate and menacing, the kind of tone that suggested private conversations between people who understood each other's needs. "You're an interesting case, Lieutenant Commander," he said, positioning himself so that her chair was trapped between his body and the briefing table. "Most officers in your position understand the situation much more quickly, but I appreciate a challenge. Makes the eventual outcome more satisfying." His hand moved to rest on the back of her chair, fingers drumming against the leather in a rhythm that emphasized his control over the space around her. Kane's posture remained unchanged, though Hayes noticed her breathing had shifted slightly, deeper, more controlled, like someone preparing for physical exertion rather than someone paralyzed by fear. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, but there was something different about the way she held them, a readiness that hadn't been there during their initial conversation. Professional instincts honed by decades of reading people suggested she was evaluating options rather than accepting inevitability. "You know what I think your real problem is?" Hayes continued, his confidence returning as he interpreted her stillness as the beginning of capitulation. "You've spent too much time in administrative roles, too much time behind desks writing reports instead of learning how things actually work in operational environments. You've forgotten that the military is fundamentally about power, who has it, who doesn't, and what happens when those relationships get tested." His free hand moved to her shoulder again, but this time the contact carried unmistakable intention. Fingers that pressed deeper, lingered longer, traced patterns that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with establishing ownership. Kane's reaction was minimal, a slight tensing of muscles, a fractional adjustment of position, but Hayes registered these responses as progress toward the kind of submission he'd learned to cultivate. "The beauty of your situation," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student, "is that nobody would believe you if you tried to report this conversation. Admiral with 30 years of unblemished service versus lieutenant commander with attitude problems and questionable judgment about respecting authority. The outcome of any investigation would be predetermined before the first question got asked." Kane spoke for the first time since her earlier warning, her voice carrying the same conversational tone that had unsettled Hayes before. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, delivered with the clinical precision of someone making an observation rather than an accusation. "Recently, multiple times, you have a system." Hayes paused, momentarily thrown by her directness. Most of his previous targets had avoided acknowledging the obvious, preferring to maintain fictional narratives about professional relationships and career guidance that allowed them to preserve some psychological distance from reality. Kane's blunt recognition of the pattern suggested a different kind of psychological profile, someone who processed threats analytically rather than emotionally. "Smart girl," he said, recovering his composure and deciding to embrace the transparency she'd introduced. Yes, I have a system. Yes, it works. And yes, you're going to discover exactly how effective it can be when applied by someone who understands the proper relationship between authority and compliance. His grip tightened on her shoulder, fingers digging into muscle with enough pressure to cause discomfort without leaving marks. The physical escalation was calculated, designed to test her pain tolerance and establish his willingness to use force if gentler persuasion proved insufficient. Hayes had learned that measured application of discomfort often achieved better results than dramatic violence, creating submission without generating the kind of obvious injuries that might complicate subsequent interactions or raise questions from medical personnel. Kane's response was to look directly at him with an expression that combined professional interest with something that might have been pity. "Admiral, do you know what my actual military occupational specialty code is?" she asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about his knowledge rather than defiance of his authority. "Not the one listed on my personnel summary, but my actual operational classification." The question was unexpected enough that Hayes hesitated before answering. He'd reviewed Kane's file carefully, had noted her intelligence background and overseas experience, had identified the factors that made her suitable for his purposes. But military occupational specialties were administrative details that rarely impacted the personal dynamics he was more interested in developing. "Intelligence analyst," he said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Overseas deployment experience, security clearance appropriate for intelligence work. Standard background for someone in your position." Even as he spoke, Hayes recognized that his knowledge of Kane's actual qualifications was more superficial than he'd realized. "Close," Kane said, her smile widening in ways that made Hayes increasingly uncomfortable. "But not quite accurate. You see, Admiral, intelligence analyst was my cover assignment, the job description that appeared on organizational charts and duty rosters. My actual work required different qualifications, different training, different skill sets." Hayes felt the first genuine flicker of doubt since the confrontation began. Something in Kane's tone suggested knowledge he didn't possess, capabilities he hadn't calculated into his assessment of the situation. But retreat wasn't an option now. Too much had been said. Too much had been done to allow for face-saving withdrawal from a confrontation he'd initiated and escalated beyond the point of plausible deniability. "I don't care about your background," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Whatever you think you've done, wherever you think you've been, it doesn't change what's happening in this room right now. In here, your specialties don't matter. Your training doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is understanding who's in charge." Kane nodded, as if agreeing with his assessment, though her expression suggested she was evaluating information rather than accepting authority. "You're absolutely right about one thing, Admiral. In here, the only thing that matters is understanding who's in charge. We just disagree about who that is." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That was when Hayes realized that Lieutenant Commander Kane wasn't intimidated, wasn't submitting, and wasn't following any pattern he'd encountered before. But by then, his hand was already moving toward her face in what would be his final mistake. The moment stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with tension that had been building since Admiral Hayes first locked the door behind his dismissed aide. Everything that had led to this point, the careful isolation, the gradual escalation, the systematic boundary violations, had been preparation for what Hayes considered the inevitable conclusion to their encounter. In his experience, this was where resistance finally broke, where his targets accepted the reality of their situation and began the psychological adjustment to new relationship dynamics. But Lieutenant Commander Kane sat motionless in a way that suggested coiled energy rather than paralyzed fear. Her breathing had shifted to a pattern Hayes didn't recognize, but that seemed somehow familiar, like something he might have observed in special operations personnel before high-stress missions. Her hands remained folded, but there was tension in her shoulders that spoke of readiness rather than resignation. Most unsettling was her expression, not the defeated submission he'd learned to expect, but analytical focus that made him feel like a specimen being studied. "You know what the real problem is with your system, Admiral," Kane said, her voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing technical specifications rather than personal violation. "It relies on victims who don't have options, who can't fight back effectively, who need to preserve their careers more than they need to preserve their dignity. But you never verified that I fit those parameters." Hayes felt something cold move through his chest. Not quite alarm, but recognition that this conversation was moving in directions he hadn't anticipated. His previous targets had never analyzed his methods so explicitly, had never demonstrated the kind of professional detachment that suggested they were evaluating his tactics rather than submitting to them. Kane's clinical assessment of his approach indicated a psychological profile that didn't match his expectations or his experience. "Are you threatening me, Lieutenant Commander?" he asked, though the question emerged more uncertain than he'd intended. The familiar script that had served him successfully in similar situations seemed inadequate for Kane's responses, which suggested knowledge and capability that his superficial review of her background hadn't revealed. "Because if you are, you should consider very carefully whether that's a wise career decision." Kane tilted her head slightly, like someone considering an interesting proposition. "I'm not threatening you, Admiral. I'm educating you. There's a difference." Her voice carried the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a student who'd missed fundamental principles. "You see, threats are what people make when they want to intimidate others into compliance. Education is what happens when someone needs to understand reality they've been avoiding." The distinction felt important in ways Hayes couldn't quite articulate, though his survival instincts were beginning to suggest that this encounter was developing along lines that required different strategies than he'd employed successfully before. Kane's calm wasn't the controlled panic of someone trying to maintain dignity while accepting defeat. It was the professional composure of someone who'd assessed a situation and reached conclusions that hadn't occurred to him. Hayes moved his hand from her shoulder to her face, fingers tracing her jawline in a gesture designed to be possessive and intimate. The contact was deliberately inappropriate, crossing boundaries that made clear his intentions, while maintaining the kind of gradual escalation that had proven effective in breaking down psychological resistance. In his experience, this level of violation typically triggered either compliance or desperate attempts at negotiation that could be managed through patient application of authority. But Kane's reaction was neither. She looked at his hand like it was an interesting object that had appeared unexpectedly, something worthy of professional attention rather than personal distress. "That's assault, Admiral," she said matter-of-factly, her tone carrying the clinical precision of someone documenting evidence rather than expressing fear. "Unwanted physical contact with sexual intent, aggravated by abuse of authority position, clear violation of Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 120. The legal terminology was delivered with casual expertise that suggested familiarity with prosecution procedures rather than abstract knowledge of military law. Hayes felt his confidence falter as Kane demonstrated understanding of consequences, He'd assumed she wouldn't be able to pursue effectively. But retreat wasn't possible now. Too much had been done to allow for face-saving withdrawal from a confrontation that had moved beyond plausible deniability. "Nobody's going to believe your version of events," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Admiral with unblemished record versus lieutenant commander with questionable judgment and attitude problems. Any investigation would conclude that you misinterpreted professional interaction as something inappropriate. Even as he spoke, Hayes recognized that his usual defensive strategies felt inadequate against someone who seemed to be building a case rather than experiencing trauma. Kane nodded as if considering his legal analysis seriously. "Interesting theory. Let's test it." She reached into her uniform pocket with movement so casual that Hayes didn't recognize it as tactical until she was holding something in her palm. A small device, black metal and ceramic, with indicators that suggested active recording capability. Voice-activated recorder, military grade, admissible as evidence in courts-martial proceedings. Everything you've said in this room has been documented with time-stamp precision. Hayes stared at the device, his mind racing through implications he hadn't considered when he disabled the room's official surveillance systems. His careful preparation had eliminated institutional monitoring, but he hadn't anticipated personal recording equipment that would capture conversations he'd assumed would remain private. The device represented evidence that could destroy his career, regardless of Kane's credibility or his ability to influence investigative procedures. That's not possible," he said, though even as he spoke, Hayes realized that someone with Kane's clearance level would have access to equipment he hadn't considered. Personal recording devices aren't authorized in classified briefing rooms. Security protocols prohibit. "Personal recording devices aren't authorized for most personnel," Kane corrected, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining technical details to a civilian. "But my operational clearance includes authorization for evidence collection in situations involving security violations or criminal conduct, which this definitely qualifies as, Admiral." The revelation changed everything Hayes thought he understood about their encounter. Kane hadn't been trapped by his careful preparation. She'd been conducting an investigation that had documented his crimes with precision that would make prosecution straightforward regardless of his institutional connections or political influence. The evidence she'd gathered would eliminate the ambiguity that had protected him in previous situations, where accusations relied on testimony alone. But recognition of his mistake came too late, because Hayes had already committed to escalation that couldn't be reversed through negotiation or administrative pressure. His hand was moving toward her face again, but this time with clenched fist, rather than caressing fingers driven by rage and desperation rather than calculated intimidation. Kane saw the punch coming and smiled. "Perfect," she said quietly. "Assault with intent to cause bodily harm. That makes everything that happens next legally justifiable self-defense." Admiral Hayes threw the punch that would end his career, his freedom, and possibly his consciousness. But by the time his fist began moving toward her face, Lieutenant Commander Kane was already calculating the precise angle and force required to ensure he never hit anyone again. The punch moved through air with all the authority Admiral Hayes had accumulated over 30 years of military service, driven by rage and desperation and the particular fury of someone who just realized his carefully constructed system was collapsing around him. His fist carried the weight of 3 stars, the momentum of unchecked power, and the violence of a predator whose territory had been invaded by something he'd fundamentally failed to understand. But physics operates according to principles that don't recognize military rank or institutional authority, and Hayes had just initiated contact with someone whose understanding of violence had been refined in places where mistakes weren't career-ending, they were fatal. Lieutenant Commander Kane moved with precision that transformed the Admiral's aggression into a lesson in applied biomechanics that would be studied in medical facilities for months afterward. Kane's left hand intercepted Hayes' wrist mid-swing, fingers locking around bone and tendon with pressure that stopped his punch before it reached her face. Not a desperate block or lucky deflection, but calculated interception that demonstrated she'd been tracking his movement from the moment his shoulders telegraphed his intention. Her grip was positioned with anatomical precision that compressed nerve clusters responsible for motor control, rendering his fist harmless while maintaining complete control over his arm's trajectory. Simultaneously, her right hand drove upward in a palm strike that connected with Hayes' chin at precisely the angle required to transfer maximum kinetic energy to his brain stem. Not the wild haymaker of someone fighting for survival, but surgical application of force designed to achieve specific neurological results. The impact sent shock waves through his nervous system that disrupted electrical signals between brain and body, creating momentary paralysis that left him conscious but unable to coordinate movement. Hayes felt his legs buckle as his balance centers struggled to process conflicting sensory input. The room tilted sideways in ways that defied his understanding of physics, and his vision blurred as his brain attempted to reconcile the disconnect between what his eyes were seeing and what his inner ear was reporting. Kane maintained control of his captured arm while he fell, using his own weight to guide his descent in directions that prevented him from striking furniture or injuring himself beyond the damage she'd already calculated as necessary. But Kane wasn't finished because Admiral Hayes wasn't unconscious, and conscious predators represented ongoing threats that required complete neutralization. As his body hit the floor in what appeared to be uncontrolled collapse, she followed him down with movement that looked casual but was actually tactical positioning, designed to maintain dominance while preventing recovery. Her knee found the pressure point behind his ear with mathematical precision, applying exactly enough pressure to compress the carotid artery without causing permanent damage. The technique was called a sleeper hold in popular culture, though Kane's training had taught her the clinical terminology and physiological mechanisms that made it effective. Properly applied pressure to the carotid artery reduced blood flow to the brain by approximately 70%, causing unconsciousness within 3 to 7 seconds, depending on the target's physical condition and stress response. Hayes struggled briefly, his hands clawing at her leg, with diminishing coordination as oxygen deprivation took effect. But his efforts were futile against someone who'd been trained to apply chokes against opponents who'd been specifically trained to resist them. Admiral Hayes' consciousness faded like a television being turned off. Not the dramatic collapse portrayed in movies, but gradual dimming of awareness that left him peaceful and still on the briefing room floor. Kane maintained pressure for exactly 4 seconds after he stopped moving, ensuring complete unconsciousness while avoiding the brain damage that could result from prolonged compression. When she finally released the hold, Hayes breathed steadily and naturally, his pulse strong but slow, his body positioned in recovery position that would prevent aspiration if he vomited during the transition back to consciousness. The entire sequence had required less than 8 seconds, from the moment Hayes began his punch to the moment his unconscious body settled against the mahogany flooring. Kane stood slowly, adjusting her uniform with automatic precision while conducting rapid assessment of Hayes' condition and the tactical situation that would develop when he regained consciousness. His breathing was regular, his color was good, and his pulse suggested he would wake up naturally within 5 to 10 minutes, with nothing more serious than a headache and severely damaged ego. But Kane's immediate concern wasn't Hayes's medical condition. It was the two bodyguards stationed outside the briefing room who would have heard the sound of their principal hitting the floor. Professional security personnel trained to respond to threats against flag officers they were assigned to protect. Men who would interpret sounds of struggle as indication that their protectee required immediate assistance, regardless of whatever instructions they'd been given about maintaining privacy during sensitive discussions. Kane moved to the door with the same controlled precision she'd applied to neutralizing Hayes, though her objectives now shifted from combat to crisis management. The recorder in her pocket had documented everything, providing evidence that would ensure legal proceedings favored accurate interpretation of events rather than institutional damage control. But evidence meant nothing if she couldn't survive the next few minutes with Hayes' bodyguards, who would see their unconscious principal and draw conclusions that might not align with legal realities. She positioned herself beside the door, calculating angles and distances, while listening for sounds that would indicate immediate response from exterior security. The room's soundproofing would have muffled most noise, but the specific thud of a 200-pound body striking the floor might have been audible to trained personnel whose jobs required attention to subtle audio cues that could indicate threats to their protected asset. Kane's breathing remained controlled, her heart rate elevated but manageable, her mental state focused on tactical considerations that would determine whether this situation concluded with Hayes in custody or her in a morgue. She'd neutralized the immediate threat, but Admiral Hayes represented just one component of a larger security apparatus that included people with guns and authorization to use them if they believed circumstances required lethal force to protect flag officer personnel. The silence outside the door stretched for several seconds, long enough for Kane to hope that the bodyguards hadn't heard Hayes fall, short enough that she remained prepared for immediate contact with armed men who might not be interested in lengthy explanations about sexual assault and justifiable self-defense. Her hand moved automatically to her service weapon, though she hoped desperately that the situation wouldn't require additional violence against personnel who were simply doing their jobs, protecting someone they didn't know was a predator. Admiral Hayes stirred slightly on the floor behind her, unconsciousness beginning its natural retreat as his brain recovered from temporary oxygen deprivation. Kane had perhaps 3 minutes before he regained full awareness, 3 minutes to prepare for conversations that would determine whether justice or institutional protection would govern what happened next. The door handle turned, and Kane squared her shoulders to face whatever came next. The door opened with the controlled precision of security personnel, trained to assess threat situations before taking action. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez entered first, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm but not yet drawn, his eyes sweeping the room in the methodical pattern that identified exits, obstacles, and potential weapons, before focusing on the unconscious admiral sprawled across the mahogany flooring. Behind him, Petty Officer Second Class Thompson maintained position in the doorway, providing cover while preventing unauthorized access to what had clearly become a crime scene. Rodriguez had 22 years of experience protecting flag officers in environments ranging from Pentagon briefings to forward operating bases in hostile territory. He'd seen admirals collapse from medical emergencies, witnessed assassination attempts against general officers, and responded to security threats that required split-second decisions about when to use lethal force. But he'd never encountered a situation where his protectee was unconscious on the floor while a female officer stood calmly beside the door, hands visible, posture relaxed, with an expression that suggested she was waiting for something rather than fleeing from something. "Ma'am, step away from Admiral Hayes and identify yourself," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His assessment of the scene suggested Kane represented either a threat that had neutralized his principal or a potential victim who required protection from unknown assailants. The absence of blood or obvious trauma complicated his evaluation, as did Kane's demeanor, which projected professional composure rather than fear or aggression. Kane raised her hands slowly, palms visible, in universal gesture of non-threatening intent. "Master Chief, I'm Lieutenant Commander Alexis Kane, Naval Intelligence. Admiral Hayes is unconscious but stable. He'll regain consciousness within the next few minutes with no permanent injury." Her voice carried the clinical precision of someone providing medical assessment rather than the emotional distress that Rodriguez might have expected from someone involved in violent confrontation with a flag officer. Thompson's hand moved toward his weapon as he processed Kane's words. "Ma'am, did you assault Admiral Hayes?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was having difficulty reconciling the idea of a female lieutenant commander successfully attacking a male admiral with what his training had taught him about physical confrontations between personnel of different sizes and experience levels. "I defended myself against Admiral Hayes' physical assault after he committed sexual battery," Kane replied, her words delivered with matter-of-fact clarity that eliminated ambiguity about her version of events. "Everything that occurred in this room has been recorded and will be submitted as evidence in the criminal proceedings that will follow this incident." Rodriguez felt the situation shifting in directions his security training hadn't prepared him to handle. Protection of flag officers from external threats was straightforward. Identify hostile actors and neutralize them through appropriate application of force. But scenarios where the flag officer himself was the apparent aggressor, where the potential victim had successfully defended herself, where evidence of criminal conduct might exist, these circumstances required different protocols that fell outside his areas of expertise. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain in position while we secure Admiral Hayes and request medical assistance," Rodriguez said, though uncertainty crept into his voice as he attempted to apply standard procedures to a situation that clearly wasn't standard. His primary responsibility was ensuring Hayes' safety and well-being, but that obligation became complicated when the Admiral's condition apparently resulted from his own criminal behavior rather than external attack. Kane nodded agreement, maintaining her position, while Rodriguez knelt beside Hayes to assess his condition. Pulse steady, breathing regular, pupils responsive but dilated, skin color normal, all indicators of someone recovering from controlled unconsciousness rather than serious head trauma. Rodriguez had seen similar presentations in personnel who'd been subdued through non-lethal force by military police or security contractors, though he'd never encountered a situation where a flag officer was the recipient of such techniques. "Thompson, contact headquarters and request immediate response from Naval Criminal Investigative Service," Rodriguez said, making the decision that this situation required investigation by personnel trained to handle crimes involving senior military officers. "Also request medical evaluation team and legal counsel for all parties involved. This is now a potential criminal matter requiring proper documentation and chain of custody procedures." Kane remained silent as Thompson initiated communications with base security, though she noted the professional manner in which both bodyguards were handling circumstances that must have been personally and professionally challenging. Their primary loyalty was to Admiral Hayes, but their training included obligations to military justice that took precedence over personal relationships or institutional protection. Admiral Hayes began stirring on the floor, consciousness returning as his brain recovered from temporary oxygen deprivation. His first attempts at movement were uncoordinated, hands reaching automatically toward his head as neurological systems came back online, but his breathing remained steady and his color continued to improve. Rodriguez watched carefully for signs of serious head injury or complications that might require immediate medical intervention. Kane retrieved the recording device from her pocket, holding it visible to both security personnel. Master Chief, this device contains complete audio documentation of Admiral Hayes' sexual assault and my defensive response. I'm prepared to provide this evidence to NCIS investigators when they arrive, along with detailed statement about the criminal conduct that occurred in this room. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, changing the atmosphere in ways that couldn't be reversed. Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their shared recognition that their careers had just intersected with something far more serious than routine security duty. Admiral Hayes was stirring toward full consciousness, which meant he would soon be aware enough to provide his own version of events, though his credibility had been fundamentally undermined by Kane's possession of recorded evidence. Ma'am, NCIS will handle evidence collection and statements from all parties, Rodriguez said, though his tone suggested he understood that standard procedures might prove inadequate for circumstances involving a flag officer accused of sexual assault. For now, I need everyone to remain in position until investigators arrive and can properly document the scene. Hayes opened his eyes, blinking in confusion as awareness returned, and memory began reconstructing the events that had led to his current position on the briefing room floor. His gaze found Kane first, then shifted to his bodyguards, then back to Kane with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed authority had collapsed along with his consciousness. "What?" Hayes began, his voice thick and uncertain as he struggled to organize thoughts that felt fragmented and incomplete. The last clear memory he could access was throwing a punch that should have connected with Kane's face, though obviously something had gone wrong between intention and execution. "Admiral Hayes," Kane said quietly, her voice carrying the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout their encounter, "you're under arrest." The transformation at Riverside Naval Intelligence Center began within hours of Admiral Hayes' arrest, though the changes weren't immediately visible to personnel who hadn't witnessed the confrontation. In Briefing Room 7, NCIS investigators had arrived with the methodical efficiency that characterized federal law enforcement responses to crimes involving flag officers, their black SUVs, and serious expressions signaling that routine military discipline had escalated into criminal proceedings that would attract attention from Pentagon leadership and congressional oversight committees. Lieutenant Commander Kane had spent 6 hours providing detailed testimony to investigators who recorded every word with digital precision while building case files that would determine whether Admiral Hayes faced court-martial or civilian prosecution. Her recording device had provided unambiguous evidence of sexual assault, attempted rape, and abuse of authority, crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, especially when committed by officers whose oaths included specific pledges to protect those under their command. The evidence was overwhelming enough that Hayes' military counsel had recommended immediate plea negotiations rather than trial proceedings that would result in public exposure of details that could damage institutional reputation and personal legacy. But Kane's testimony had made clear that she wasn't interested in quiet resolution that allowed powerful predators to disappear into retirement with benefits intact and reputations preserved. Through administrative discretion, news of the arrest had spread through unofficial channels with the speed that characterized all significant developments involving senior leadership. Officers who'd served under Hayes began reviewing their own experiences with new perspective, recognizing behavioral patterns they'd previously attributed to demanding leadership style rather than predatory opportunism. Female personnel who'd requested transfers from his command found their decisions validated by events that explained instincts they'd struggled to articulate through official complaint procedures. Commander Sarah Mitchell had been among the first to contact NCIS investigators with information about Hayes's previous conduct. Her testimony described systematic harassment that had escalated over months until she'd accepted transfer to less desirable assignment rather than continue enduring behavior that made her workdays psychological endurance tests. The investigators had listened with professional attention while building supplementary cases that would ensure Hayes faced consequences for crimes extending beyond his assault on Kane. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen had provided similar testimony about incidents that occurred during joint training exercises where Hayes had leveraged temporary command authority to create opportunities for inappropriate contact disguised as professional interaction. Her detailed recollections of dates, times, and witnesses had provided corroborating evidence that established patterns of predatory behavior spanning multiple years and numerous victims. The psychological impact on base personnel was complex and varied, though most officers expressed relief that someone had finally held Hayes accountable for behavior that had been whispered about but never officially addressed. Junior female officers reported feeling safer, more confident that institutional protection existed for personnel who reported sexual assault, rather than victims being blamed for destroying careers of respected senior leaders through accusations that couldn't be proven conclusively. Kane had returned to duty 3 days after the incident, though her routine assignments now included additional responsibilities that reflected her role as primary witness in criminal proceedings that would likely continue for months. Her presence on base carried symbolic weight that extended beyond her individual case, proof that military justice could function correctly when victims possessed evidence and courage necessary to pursue accountability through proper legal channels. The administrative aftermath had proven nearly as complex as the criminal investigation itself. Hayes's immediate suspension pending trial created leadership vacuum that required emergency appointments and restructured command authority throughout the intelligence division. His previous decisions were subjected to review that identified several instances where personal prejudices had influenced professional evaluations and assignment recommendations in ways that had damaged careers and operational effectiveness. Personnel who'd suffered under Hayes's leadership found themselves eligible for administrative relief that included corrected fitness reports, reassignment opportunities, and in some cases, financial compensation for career damage caused by his abuse of authority. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but it represented institutional acknowledgement that Hayes' crimes had extended beyond individual assault into systemic corruption of military justice that had protected him while punishing his victims. Kane's own career prospects had changed dramatically, though not in ways she'd anticipated when she first entered Briefing Room 7. Her successful defense against Hayes had attracted attention from special operations commands that recruited personnel with demonstrated capability to handle extreme situations under pressure. Multiple assignment offers had arrived from units whose work required individuals who could maintain operational security while navigating complex legal and political environments. But Kane had chosen to remain at Riverside temporarily, serving as informal mentor to female officers who were learning to recognize and report inappropriate behavior from superiors who believed rank provided immunity from consequences. Her willingness to pursue criminal charges despite personal and professional risks had inspired others to speak about experiences they'd previously kept silent, creating cultural shift that prioritized victim protection over institutional reputation management. The broader implications extended beyond individual justice to systemic reform that addressed environmental factors that had allowed Hayes to operate without effective oversight for decades. New reporting procedures eliminated administrative barriers that had previously discouraged victims from filing complaints, while revised investigation protocols ensured that allegations against senior officers received proper attention rather than being buried through informal peer counseling that protected perpetrators. Training programs were implemented that educated personnel about recognizing and responding to sexual harassment before it escalated to assault, while leadership development courses emphasized ethical responsibility and appropriate use of authority in ways that had been overlooked during Hayes's generation of officer education. The changes represented acknowledgement that military effectiveness required elimination of predatory behavior that undermined unit cohesion and operational security. Kane sat in the same briefing room where she'd knocked out Admiral Hayes, though the space felt different now. Smaller somehow, less intimidating, just another meeting room where people discussed professional matters without fear that authority would be perverted into opportunity for personal gratification. Her uniform bore new ribbons that reflected commendations for courage and leadership that had been awarded quietly but meaningfully by commanders who understood that real strength required protection of the vulnerable rather than exploitation of power differentials. She thought about Admiral Hayes, currently confined to military detention while awaiting trial that would determine whether he spent his remaining years in federal prison or military stockade. His fall from grace had been absolute and irreversible, his career destroyed, his reputation demolished, his future reduced to whatever mercy might be shown to someone who'd betrayed every principle military service claimed to represent. But Kane's victory wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about proving that predators could be stopped, that victims could fight back successfully, that institutional power couldn't protect criminals forever if their targets possessed courage and evidence necessary to pursue justice through appropriate channels. The military was changing, slowly but definitively, becoming the professional organization it had always claimed to be but hadn't always managed to achieve. And Lieutenant Commander Alexis Kane had helped make that change possible by refusing to accept that silence was safety, that compliance was wisdom, that powerful men deserved protection more than the people they victimized. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. And transformation had begun the moment Admiral Hayes hit the floor of Briefing Room 7. What do you think happened to Admiral Hayes when he finally faced trial? And could you have stayed as calm as Lieutenant Commander Kane when facing someone who thought his rank made him untouchable? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that real strength isn't about intimidation, but about protecting others, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove courage comes in all forms. Hit that notification bell because tomorrow we're sharing another story about someone who refused to stay silent when authority figures thought they were above the law. You won't want to miss it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.